In the early morning of the 11th of June 1940, just a day after entering the war, a force of 73 Italian aircraft took off from their bases in Sicily and turned south towards their target, Britain's Mediterranean island fortress, Malta. Rising to meet the attackers head-on was Malta's entire fighter force, just 3 Sea Gladiator biplanes, the legendary trio, Faith, Hope and Charity. The aerial duel about to unfold was the first of many, a frenzied fight for survival and national pride over Britain's last bastion in the Med. The Italians, and later the Germans, had the isolated island under almost constant air attack for nearly 3 years, while British pilots flew again and again against overwhelming odds in the air, and Maltese civilians struggled for survival on the ground. So, who came out on top? Which combination of aircraft, training, weapons and tactics was superior? The best pilots on both sides, flying the most capable fighter aircraft their countries could offer, with only one objective: get the other guy before he gets you. Welcome to Dogfight, 1940, Malta Madness. To properly explain why Italian bomber aircraft were attacking Malta and why Britain was so desperate to defend it, we'll need some context. Malta itself is located in the central Mediterranean, just south of Sicily, east of Tunisia, and north of Libya, and is really an archipelago of 3 small islands: Malta, Gozo, and Comino. The largest, Malta, is just 9 miles wide. It has a rich history spanning centuries, but for this video we will focus on one thing: how critical it was to the British war effort. In the late 19th century, Malta, largely thanks to its unique geography and large natural harbours, was becoming the naval linchpin of Britain's empire and home of the massive Mediterranean fleet. By the 20th century, Malta possessed the most extensive docking and repair facilities outside the British Isles, and served to connect Britain to her colonial territories in the east through the Suez Canal. And that was all fine and dandy because Britain was allied with the 2 other naval powers in the Med, France and Italy. But things change. The person doing the changing was Italy's new leader, Benito Mussolini, the original fascist egomaniac. Benito wanted to expand and strengthen the Italian empire across the Mediterranean, but soon realised that this could only happen through conflict with Britain and France. When Hitler announced his plans for rearmament in 1935, Mussolini saw his chance. Align with Germany, go to war with Britain and/or France, and seize as much of the Mediterranean as possible using an expanded navy, the Regia Marina, and Air Force, Regia Aeronautica. Bello. But this plan had went into action long before 1940. In October 1935, Mussolini unleashed his brutal invasion of Ethiopia, further expanding Italy's East African territories, while Britain and France protested but declined to get involved. The British did realise, however, that the Mediterranean fleet at Malta was currently well within range of Italian aircraft based on Sicily, which was just 60 miles to the north, or 25 minutes flying time. At that time, Malta had a grand total of 6 anti-aircraft guns and no RAF presence, so the Admiralty decided to move the fleet south, to Alexandria in Egypt. The developing Regia Aeronautica would also be sent to assist fascist forces in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, intent on creating an ally to the west of the Mediterranean and putting more pressure on Gibraltar. By this time, the Italians had become convinced that Malta could be neutralised using air power alone, and this is where the incompetence begins. The Regia Aeronautica's leadership in the 1930s were wedded to 2 key theories. The first was that bombers alone could win campaigns by destroying the enemy's will to fight through bombing of population and industrial centres, i.e. terror bombing, or area bombing as the British euphemistically put it. The second theory was to do with their fighter designs, namely that manoeuvrability is the key attribute of a fighter aircraft, and dogfights are often won by the pilot in the nimbler machine with the tightest turning circle. Keep these 2 key theories in mind as we delve into the individual aircraft that the Italians were developing and putting into production at that time. In August 1936, the Regia Aeronautica put into motion a plan to have 3,000 Italian combat aircraft operational within 4 years. For context, at the start of 1935, the Italians had around 600 combat aircraft. They also wanted at least 2/3 of this total to be new designs, so a series of design competitions were organised. This would become the R programme, which was scheduled to be completed in the second half of 1940. Of course, this was borderline insane. The Italian aerospace industry did not have the expertise, resources, or production capacity to design and build modern fighters, bombers, or engines to that scale. But fascist dictators don't typically get told bad news. Anyway, despite being convinced that the Italian bomber fleet could bring Malta to her knees almost single-handedly, the Regia Aeronautica had not operated a large bomber since the Caproni CA-3 of World War I vintage. This changed in 1934, when specifications were laid out for a modern medium bomber that would eventually emerge as the Fiat BR-20 Stork, but also ordered the inferior Caproni CA-135 and Piaggio P-32 as backup options. These two backups were both retired by 1939. The Stork entered service in 1936, powered by a pair of unreliable 1,000 horsepower Fiat A80 engines, which left the aircraft underpowered and required extensive maintenance. Some improvements would be made to the BR-20M models of 1940, but the Stork was soon eclipsed by another Italian design, the Savoia Marchetti SM-79 Sparrowhawk. Ironically, the SM-79 was never intended to be a military aircraft. It was a high-speed, long-range passenger aircraft powered by three 780 horsepower Alfa radials. While having less power than the 1,000 horsepower Fiat or Piaggio designs, the Alfas were much more reliable, and the tri-motor configuration of the SM-79 gave it higher power to weight and better manoeuvrability than the BR-20 despite its lower maximum payload, 1,250 kilograms compared to the Fiat's 1,600 kilograms. The third medium bomber of this period was the Cantieri Aeronautici e Navali Triestini Cant Z-1007 Kingfisher. This was an adaptation of the Cant Z-506 floatplane. The Z-1007 was another tri-motor, initially powered by an 830 horsepower Asso inline engine, but later equipped with 1000 horsepower Piaggio radials, becoming the Z-1007 bis. And this was a very capable design, having a higher speed, ceiling and bomb load than Italy's other medium bombers. The drawback was that it was an all-wood design, making it difficult and expensive to produce. Despite the insistence on area bombing, the Italians thought it prudent to create a dive bomber as well, which emerged as the SM-85. This was a smaller, twin-engined aircraft with two 460 horsepower Piaggio radial engines that could, in theory, carry a single 500 kilogram bomb. In reality, the SM-85 was severely underpowered, even after releasing its bomb. It also shook violently during a dive, and some even went into uncontrollable spins. The conclusions that the Regia Aeronautica's leadership took from this design, as well as the poor performance of the Breda, BA-65 and BA-88, was that dive bombing was largely ineffective. Considering that the Italians witnessed firsthand the success of the Junkers 87 Stuka in the Spanish campaign, this seems like quite an insane conclusion to make, but there we are. To escort these new bombers to their targets, the Regia Aeronautica began development of a new fleet of fighter aircraft. In November 1936, they announced a new fighter contest for one monoplane and one biplane. Yes, the success of the nimble Fiat CR-32 biplane over Spain against the far faster Soviet I-16 monoplane had solidified the Italian belief that manoeuvrability was key, and a new, highly manoeuvrable biplane would be useful in the years to come. This aircraft would emerge as the Fiat CR-42 Falcon, which only flew for the first time in May 1938, and pushed the biplane configuration to its technical limits, with an 840 horsepower engine powering it to speeds of over 270 miles per hour, while boasting twin 50 caliber machine guns in the nose. The winner of the monoplane competition was the Machi C.200 Lightning, first flying in December 1937. It was, of course, very manoeuvrable, and using the same power plant as the Falcon, it could go even faster, up to 312 miles per hour, the fastest Italian fighter yet produced. However, compared to contemporary British or German designs like the Spitfire or the Bf-109, the Lightning was either far slower, significantly underarmed, or both, with only the twin 50 caliber machine guns compared to the 8 303s of the British aircraft or the cannons of the Germans. These deficiencies can both be traced back to the engine. Machi were forced to use the 840 horsepower A74 when the reliability issues of the 1000 horsepower engines came to light, and the armament was reduced from 5 guns to 2 to compensate. To add to the aircraft woes, the modern all-metal construction was a challenge for Italian firms, with shortages of experience and equipment. As a result, despite it being an inferior aircraft in almost every way, it took 4 times longer to produce than the latest Messerschmitt Bf-109E. In November 1939, there was a lifeline, as the Regia Aeronautica struck a deal with Daimler-Benz to license produce the DB601A1, a 1085 horsepower inline engine. Machi received a couple of Daimler-Benz engines from the German firm and worked on an updated fighter design that would eventually become the C.200 Thunderbolt. This new aircraft was a large improvement on the Lightning, with higher speed, longer range and a higher ceiling, but it would only enter service in July 1941, more than a year after the war began for the Italians. Maybe I sound dismissive. None of these Italian designs were necessarily bad aircraft. If they'd been produced in significant numbers, then Mussolini would have had a formidable fleet at his disposal. However, his own imperial ambitions were getting in the way. Between the years of 1935 and 1940, 66% of Italy's defence budget was spent on funding the ongoing military operations in Ethiopia, Spain and Albania, leaving only 34% for domestic rearmament, a large chunk of which went to the navy. Throughout this period, Mussolini and the rest of Italy's Comando Supremo were fed false figures by the Regia Aeronautica's Chief of Staff, General Giuseppe Valle, who grossly overestimated the strength of Italy's air arm. The true combat readiness was only discovered in November 1939. Valle had documented a force of 5,948 combat aircraft, including 10 different types of fighters, 11 types of bombers, 4 types of observation aircraft, and 11 types of float planes and seaplanes. Of these 5,948 aircraft, 2,534 were found to have been complete fabrications. A further 612 were either in storage or consigned to flight schools, and out of the 2,802 aircraft actually in service, only 727 could be considered modern. Of these, only 396 bombers and 129 fighters were actually operational. 7 months later, at the outbreak of the war, the situation had improved, but not by much. By the dawn of the Malta campaign, the Italians had amassed 594 SM-79s, 219 BR-20s, and 87 Z-1007s. Fighter-wise, they had 300 CR-42s, 156 C.200s, and 118 of the slightly inferior Fiat G50 monoplane. Again, a large number of these were not operational. The 130,000 tons of aviation fuel that Italy had collected could sustain this fleet for about 6 months of operations. So I hope you're beginning to see the top to bottom issues of the Regia Aeronautica as it began its campaign against Malta in June 1940. Bad doctrine, poor design decisions, bad engines, a lack of experience, a lack of airframes, and rampant corruption. But trust me, it'll somehow get worse. Before that though, I want to talk about something more positive and give you an exclusive Red Wrench first look at one of the most exciting mobile games released this year that you really don't want to miss: Urban Heat. Forget everything you know about mobile shooters for a minute, because this game has the potential to change the genre forever. With next level graphics, a unique and vibrant theme, and buttery smooth gameplay with a premium feel, this game is about to make a massive impact, and you should hop on before everyone else does. Mainly so you can get ahead of people and start unlocking some of the 20 plus playable characters, each presented with a unique style and armed with their own unique ability. They're all themed around like early 2000s LA gang culture, which is refreshing after playing maybe a million military shooters. I'm always a fan of in-depth weapon customization in games. I'm an engineer at heart, remember, and Urban Heat does this so well. With 11 slots and 50 modules, it feels like you can really switch it up, and getting the right build for your playstyle is just really satisfying. Gone are the days of clunky budget mobile shooters that were really just poor clones of PC or console games. Urban Heat was developed from the ground up as a premium product, and with HD visuals and 120Hz support, it's really noticeable. I'm a bit of a fiend for the competitive side of games, and I was so excited to see that Urban Heat has a fleshed out competitive mode, with cool cosmetics and progression rewards for making it up the ranks. Luckily for me, as you've seen, I am essentially unstoppable. Download Urban Heat right now using the link in the description below, or scan this QR code to unlock exclusive rewards, including a powerful ST-A4 blueprint and 3,000 in-game cash, a bundle which would usually cost about $30. Talk about a head start. Anyway, back to 1940. So, as the Italian pilots set out on their first combat missions against Malta on the 11th of June, what was waiting for them? What had the British been cooking up on their island fortress for the last 5 years? Well, not much. After the Italian actions in Ethiopia had frightened the British into moving the fleet to Alexandria, it was back in Malta around a year later. The plan was for Malta to serve as the peacetime base for the fleet, and in wartime the island would support light forces, cruisers, destroyers and submarines. Malta was still only 25 minutes flying time from Sicily, but the British had re-evaluated the threat of the Italian Air Force and found it lacking. Knowing that the Italians still adhered to their policy of attacking warships with unguided bombs from high altitude, they estimated that the average Italian bomber had a less than 1% chance of hitting a maneuvering warship with any of its bombs. The British felt that, given how ineffective the Italian bomber arm was, the small risk was worth the massive benefit of basing ships at Malta that could then be used to raid Italian shipping lanes. However, these ships were still vulnerable in port, so an effort was made to beef up Malta's air defence network. The island already had a seaplane base at Califrana, mainly used for anti-submarine patrols. In 1923, an airstrip was constructed at Halfar in the southeast, and in 1929, this became a permanent RAF station. And while no aircraft were permanently based there, it often catered to disembarked carrier aircraft or those en route to North Africa. Even as tensions rose, the RAF flatly refused to send any aircraft to Malta, insisting that all were needed back in England to fend off the Germans. However, they did construct a new concrete airfield south of Valletta at Lucca in 1939 and began to convert the existing civilian airfield at Sicily into a military one. 3 airfields with no fighter aircraft. Despite only having 8 anti-aircraft guns across the entire island in 1935, this was soon expanded. But this was happening very slowly as, again, the priority was understandably being given to defending the south of England. Despite a plan for a drastically improved air defence system, CID Scale B defence plan, these schemes had to be scaled back, especially as the Allies entered into a war with Germany in September 1939. As a result, by June 1940, the island had 34 heavy anti-aircraft guns, 16 3-inch, 8 3.7-inch, and 10 4.5-inch. It also had 8 40mm Bofors, a number of 2-pounder pom-poms scavenged from ships, 24 searchlights, and a number of machine guns. The vast majority of the guns were concentrated around the vital dockyards at Valletta and the seaplane base and airfields of the Marsaxlokk Bay. However, Malta did have one very important asset, a radar station set up on the Dingley Cliffs. This was the first radar system located outside of Great Britain and gave the defenders the ability to detect incoming aircraft up to 50 miles away. As tensions continued to rise, the Mediterranean fleet slipped away once again, relocating to Alexandria in the spring of 1940 and leaving Malta to largely fend for itself. However, in April 1940, the island would soon receive its first, and only, fighter aircraft, as HMS Glorious put ashore 18 Gloucester Sea Gladiator biplanes at Califrana, still disassembled and in their crates. These were reserved for the aircraft currently on board Glorious, but when she was relocated to Norway at the end of the month, she took only 6 of them with her, leaving 12 in their crates on Malta. On the 19th, 4 of the Sea Gladiators were assembled, along with another 2 in early May. Another 3 would be transferred to Alexandria later that month, and a further 3 would later be given to HMS Eagle, leaving these 6 aircraft on the island. As it stood, they had nobody to fly them. Luckily, they did have some volunteers, a handful of swordfish floatplane pilots based at Califrana. These guys had no fighter experience and soon took it upon themselves to train together in their new aircraft. The Sea Gladiator was, as the name suggests, a carrier-borne variant of the Gloucester Gladiator, with arrestor hooks and storage for a rescue dinghy. The Gladiator was Britain's most capable and most recent biplane fighter, first flying in 1934, but it was still very much a biplane. Adapted from the slightly older Gloucester Gauntlet, the Gladiator was largely obsolete by the time it entered service, being eclipsed by modern monoplane fighters like the Hurricane, Spitfire, and Bf-109. In fact, if the Italians had not invaded Abyssinia in 1935, it is unlikely the Gladiator would have entered RAF service at all. The massive increase in world tension convinced the RAF to adopt the aircraft, rather than waiting for a better one. All that said, it was still a very capable little plane, with its 830 horsepower Bristol Mercury powering it to speeds of 253 miles per hour, and its armament of 4 303 machine guns packing decent punch for the time. Compared to the equivalent Italian design, the CR-42 Falcon, the Sea Gladiator was older and slower, and despite its slightly stronger armament, it really should have been easy pickings for the Italian pilots, especially considering the complete lack of experience that the British swordfish pilots had in the aircraft. So the stage had been set. We can now rejoin the 73 Italian aircraft flying towards Malta on the 11th of June 1940, with a lot more knowledge of the relative strength and motivations of each side. Only counting modern operational aircraft, the Italians had 430 bombers and 130 fighters. The British had 6 fighters and a weak selection of anti-aircraft guns. Malta had no hope, or so it seemed. The Maltese population must have watched in horror as this enemy armada had approached the island, and must have beamed with pride as the protectors roared up to meet them. The trio of Sea Gladiators that would later be known as Faith, Hope and Charity, piloted by Flight Lieutenant George Burgess, Squadron Leader Alan Martin and Flying Officer William Woods. The first raid of 73 aircraft streaked over Valletta at high altitude, around 15,000 feet. The bombers dropped 30 250kg bombs and 112 50kg bombs split between Halfar, the seaplane base at Calafrana, and the dockyards in Valletta. There were so many targets in the air that the 3 Gladiators lost contact with one another, twisting and turning in the skies above Malta to try and get their guns onto the much faster, more modern Italian planes. The Gladiators all returned safely, damaging 1 enemy aircraft in the process. A recon aircraft was intercepted later that afternoon by 2 Gladiators, driving it away. And a further raid of 38 unescorted SM-79s occurred that evening, dropping around 220 bombs and 20 incendiaries. So, 93 of Italy's most capable bomber aircraft had just dropped 43 metric tons of bombs on this tiny Mediterranean island and met, essentially, zero resistance. Despite this, they did almost no damage. The dockyards remained untouched, the seaplane base was undamaged, and despite some 250kg bombs landing on the runway at Halfar, these were quickly patched up. The Italians had swung for a knockout punch and completely missed. For the 2 weeks following the initial raid, the Regia Aeronautica was forced to focus its efforts on striking French targets, so only sent out nuisance raids of 5 to 10 bombers each to Malta, which, ironically, actually did a lot more damage, as on the 20th of June, a 250kg bomb dropped from a single SM-79 struck the floating dock in Valletta harbour, breaking its back and putting it out of action, a major blow. Another disaster occurred for the British on the 21st, when 2 of the 6 Gladiators, N5522 and N5524, were damaged in accidents. Assessing the damage to the aircraft, the engineering officer in charge determined that 1 good aircraft could be cobbled together from the 2 wrecks. N5524 was repaired, with Squadron Leader Laux remarking, "A hybrid was born out of 2 corpses." This sort of thing was typical for the Halfar fighters, which are often repaired with whatever was available. N5520, for example, was later fitted with the engine and propeller of a destroyed Blenheim just to keep it flying. But soon their fortunes changed, and on the 22nd, the Gladiators would finally get their first victory, as George Burgess recalls. Timber Woods and I were on the 1600 hours to dusk watch when the alarm went off. We took off and climbed as hard as we could go, as was the custom. We did not attempt to maintain close formation because if one aircraft could climb faster than the other, then the additional height gained might be an advantage. Ground control, as usual, gave us the position and course of the enemy. The enemy turned out to be a single SM-79, presumably on a photographic sortie. It came right down the centre of the island from Gozo, and on this occasion, we were 2,000 to 3,000 feet above it. Timber went in first, but I didn't see any result. I managed to get right behind it and shut off the port engine. I was told this happened right over Salima and Valletta and caused quite a stir in the population. The aircraft caught fire and crashed in the sea off Calafrana. To the Maltese people, the Sea Gladiators of the Halfar fighter flight were legendary, their only hope against overwhelming odds. Watching the rickety little planes trundle haphazardly into the air and climb over Valletta was a massive morale boost, especially when they were shooting down far superior Italian aircraft. Despite there being 6 functional airframes, there were never more than 3 of the little planes in the air at any one time, and so would later garner the nicknames Faith, Hope and Charity, applied to those first 3 aircraft that flew against the Italians on the 11th of June. The fuselage of N5520 Faith survives today in Malta's National War Museum in Fort St Elmo, following the wreck being presented to the people of Malta later in the war. Walking into that room where it is on display really left a lump in my throat. It's an excellent museum, and I'd highly recommend going if possible. But anyway, the French surrendered to the Italians on the 25th of June 1941, allowing the full weight of the Regia Aeronautica to be brought to bear on Malta with immediate effect, with larger raids on the 26th and 28th of June. But fortunately, despite the Sea Gladiators being hugely symbolic of Malta's struggle against overwhelming odds, They were soon bolstered with a number of significantly more capable fighters, with the first Hawker Hurricanes arriving at Halfar on the 22nd of June. The Hurricane was significantly more powerful and better armed than the Sea Gladiator. It was also faster than its Italian equivalent, the C.200, but was less manoeuvrable and not quite as fast to climb. This was balanced by the fact that the Hurricane mounted a staggering 8 3.3 machine guns compared to the 2 50 caliber machine guns of the C.200. Regardless of how strong the Hurricane was, this first shipment only included 5 aircraft, bringing the total British fighter strength on the island to 10. Luckily for the British, the Italians had just grounded their entire fleet of C.200 fighters. Yep, believe it or not, in late June 1940, the Regia Aeronautica grounded the aircraft indefinitely as the crash rate of the type had skyrocketed. Essentially, Italian pilots were being trained to maneuver aggressively in their dogfights, making tighter turns than their opponents. However, the C.200, when approaching stall speed, had a nasty habit of auto-rotating, so rolling spontaneously in either direction. This was eventually solved by the addition of detachable wing leading edges, but the C.200 would be out of service until all aircraft could be modified and pilots retrained. In an attempt to make up for the loss of the C.200s, around 30 more CR-42s were quickly brought into theatre, picking up their first kill on the 3rd of July, as a single Hurricane rose to meet a formation of 11 Italian aircraft. Another 30 SM-79s hit Malta on the 6th, with another 10 following the next day. However, on the 10th of July, the Italians once again were foiled by their poor doctrinal choices. 20 SM-79s attacked naval facilities on Manuel Island, but were soon pounced upon by 3 Hurricanes, who shot down 1 bomber and damaged a further 10 aircraft. This success was largely due to the complete absence of the 21 CR-42s that were meant to be escorting the bombers. They had arrived at the rendezvous point an hour early and had been forced to return to base low on fuel. Like most Italian fighter aircraft, none of the CR-42s had any radios, so nobody could tell them that the bombers were going to be late. Radios are of course heavy and make the plane turn slower, so you can't be having any of that. On the morning of the 16th, 12 CR-42s overflew the island on a recon mission, meeting 1 Sea Gladiator and 1 Hurricane. The Hurricane was shot down, but so was the CR-42. At the start of August, another 12 Hurricanes arrived at Lucca. 1 was written off in a crash landing, bringing British strength to 18. This was Operation Hurry. The new aircraft had been put on aircraft carrier HMS Argus, which had then sailed to a point west of Malta, where the aircraft could be flown off, landing at Lucca. This would become the standard method for reinforcing the island, known as a club run. Spares would arrive later, brought by submarines HMS Pandora and HMS Proteus. The Italians did not like this development. Their response was to start doing fighter sweeps of the island at 20,000 feet, with the plan being to dive en masse onto any British fighters rising to intercept them. The first sweep of 17 fighters was on the 4th of August, with another sweep of 20 fighters the following day. On each occasion, 2 Hurricanes were scrambled as the Italians were detected on radar, but were smart enough to climb to the south, away from the CR-42s. This gave them time to gain altitude and watch from afar as the frustrated Italian pilots soon returned home. The bombing raids continued throughout August. A notable raid on the 18th saw the first British aircraft destroyed on the ground, a Swordfish torpedo bomber. On the 20th, another aircraft was destroyed, this time at Blenheim. During August, 1 Hurricane was lost for the price of 1 CR-42. On the 5th of September, something strange happened. 6 Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers attacked Malta, targeting ground installations in the southeast. These were not, as the British initially feared, Luftwaffe aircraft, but were Regia Aeronautica Stukas. The Italian Air Force had been operating the type since early July, after the abysmal failure of their own SM-85 dive bomber prompted the Italians to purchase 50 of them from Germany. They called them picciatello, a word for describing someone eccentric or slightly mad, a crackpot. The picciatellos returned again on the 15th, with 12 Ju-87s flying alongside the prototype SM-86 dive bomber and the 24-strong fighter escort, and attacked Halfar with no huge success. On the 17th they came yet again, this time for Lucca, destroying a Wellington bomber and damaging several hangars for the loss of 1 Ju-87, when the retreating formation was pounced upon by 4 RAF Hurricanes. The Italian Stukas only flew 3 missions over Malta in September 1940 before they were transferred back to the mainland on the 27th. In fact, many of the Regia Aeronautica's bomber and fighter units were soon transferred out of Sicily and away from the Malta campaign, with only 1 raid conducted in the entire month of October. The reason for this mass exodus was the ignition of 2 new fronts for the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian campaign in Egypt that started on the 9th of September, and preparations for the invasion of Greece that would eventually commence on the 28th of October. Only a further 3 bombing raids were flown against Malta in November and December 1940. See, as early as August 1940, the Italians were convinced the campaign against Malta was more or less over. Regia Aeronautica officials believed that their sustained air campaign had successfully neutralised the island's offensive capabilities by destroying Malta's airfields and dockyards. After all, Italian convoys were arriving in North Africa with barely any British interference. There was no longer any significant Royal Navy presence on the island, and the RAF defences had barely been reinforced during the siege. It hadn't been easy, but they had done it. Well, they thought they'd done it. The reality was very, very different. Despite the 403 bombardment sorties flown between June and December 1940, Malta's airfields had never been seriously damaged and were still very much in action. The dockyard at Valletta and the nearby naval facilities were still fully functional, with the notable exception of the floating dock. The Italians had destroyed 7 RAF aircraft on the ground and 7 more in the air, for a total of 14. In achieving this tally, the Italians had lost 12 fighters and 23 bombers of their own, for a total of 35. Maltese fighter strength had almost tripled since their campaign began. Clearly the Italians had failed in pretty much all of their objectives, and they didn't even realise. The failure of the Italian Air Force to subdue Malta in any meaningful way can be chalked up to a few reasons. Number 1, their bombing was inaccurate. Accurate level bombing from 15,000 feet is nearly impossible. Even in ideal conditions, roughly half the bombs dropped would hit within 800 feet or 244 metres from their target. This increased to over 1,300 feet or 400 metres if conditions weren't so favourable. For context, this is what 1,300 feet looks like over Valletta. So good luck hitting anything meaningful. 2. Their bombs were ineffective. The Italians primarily used 100 kilogram bombs, with a few 250 kilogram bombs. Neither of these created large enough craters on airfields or large enough explosions on other targets. It just wasn't enough explosive to succeed in disabling an entire airfield for any meaningful length of time. And 3. Reinforcements continued to arrive. In October 1940, the British decided that the damage done to Malta was so light that they could resume offensive operations from the island, and on the 28th of October, 12 Wellingtons had arrived to begin bombing raids of their own. These Wellingtons conducted numerous raids on Italian cities by the end of 1940, with one raid on an airfield in Libya destroying 4 aircraft and damaging 21. Amusingly, Malta would also be used by the British to fly reconnaissance flights over the Italian naval base at Taranto, with a Malta-based Maryland taking accurate images of the Italian fleet on the 10th of November. The next evening, using the new intelligence, Swordfish torpedo bombers took off from HMS Illustrious and smashed the Italian battleships, severely damaging 3 and forcing the Italians to move their fleet to Naples. On the 14th of November, the Greeks successfully launched a counter-offensive. On the 9th of December, the British began their Egyptian counter-offensive, Operation Compass, a 2-month-long demolition of the Italian forces, which resulted in some 600 Italian aircraft being destroyed. Malta, Taranto, Greece, Egypt, it was not going well for our favourite chubby fascist, so he ended up appealing to the slightly more successful Austrian fascist for some assistance. Assistance that ended up bringing Malta to its knees. But that's a story for next time. This was merely the setup, the context, the prequel to one of the highest stakes aerial duels of the Second World War. The combined might of the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica against a desperate, starving Malta. Make sure to subscribe to see that. Thanks to Urban Heat for sponsoring this video. Remember to download now using the link in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please do leave a like down below, and if you think I'm a good bloke and want to support the channel further, please do consider supporting me on Patreon and getting extra benefits. If not, I'll see you next time.